So the next consideration we provide is what's a recommended shelter organization? And this organization that you see up on the screen up there, if you notice you should all be fairly familiar with it. It's really the ICS structure, but it's actually the way the American Red Cross structures their shelter organization. So this is what we're recommending you use. It's very general. You notice we don't identify any specific positions. We just kind of give some of the core functions under each of those sections. If you want to use this organization, it's up to you, but this is where you would insert whatever shelter organization you're going to use. So our recommendation is you just go ahead and use the American Red Cross organization because they're going to be partners with you, and that's how they're going to be organized when they work in the shelter alongside you. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay. What we next move into, and this is definitely a huge area because it's really about resource management. And for those of you who are used to working in the world of resource management for any type of threat or hazard, you know this resource management piece, it can make or break an effective response and recovery. So what we're really doing is we're kind of focusing on logistics and support for logistics and services for a care and shelter site. So if you notice the first section, we talk about that initial shelter setup. So we're kind of following that thread of there's that department again. What department or division? We have department here, but maybe it's division or position. Who's going to be responsible for going out and activating that facility setup? And so you want to identify that. Because you notice we're really describing step by step what we're doing and who's responsible for it. So the reader's getting a very clear picture. They're getting the story of how this is unfolding, who's responsible. If you notice that last bullet, pre-stage city-owned shelter resources are located in the following locations. If you don't have any pre-staged resources, you're going to delete that sentence. But as you move forward, if you do, and the core capability of care and shelter is no different than firefighting, any of our other responses that we talk about, whether it's law enforcement or public works, we're always looking to improve what we do. And so when I talk to you about maybe somehow moving forward and looking to establish your own pre-stage catches, that's a long-term strategy, but you can actually take those initial steps. Let's look at some grant opportunities. A lot of jurisdictions are looking at grant opportunities to get those pre-stage shelter resources in place. So if this isn't something that you have now, put that down on a strategic planning bullet for your future years. But you'll delete that if it doesn't apply. So the first thing that we do in this plan is we share with the reader how do resources move in our city or our jurisdiction for a care and shelter site. Now all of us have a resource management process, a large 60,000-foot view of resource management that we are fairly familiar with how resources get ordered and how they move. But we're just focusing on, okay, if a care and shelter site gets activated, how are resources going to be managed back and forth? So what we do is we provide a very simple diagram so they can at least see the points. So you notice that we've got the shelter or the field. So there may be resource requests coming from a shelter site, or maybe the field command is taking those resource requests directly from the shelter, and they're going to go ahead and push those resource requests to another point. So you've got some points for those resource requests to move to. One place that we can get resources is the American Red Cross Department Operations Center. But technically, the American Red Cross DOC is going to be working with the ARC representatives in the shelter anyway. So most of the time, that's a very fluid resource management loop that we don't really have to get, involved in. But there may be times where the American Red Cross, that we might contact the ARC DOC, whether it's the EOC or a shelter or field, to make a request, a formal request for a resource. But it's very, very limited, and it doesn't happen very often. So we're not going to focus on that one. The one we're going to focus is you may have resource requests moving between a shelter or field command to a department operations center, if you have them, A lot of small jurisdictions, their departments don't have DOCs, but rec and parks, some of your key public safety departments or divisions a lot of times will have their own internal DOC function, or the Emergency Operations Center. So if you look there, resource requests and fulfilling, allocation, and fulfilling of a resource request moves between those points. So that's a very general diagram. So right away people can see, oh, okay, I can see where resource requests might be initiated and where they might be filled, and then where those resources might go. But then we kind of go into a more, that textual language. We provided the ARC resource ordering process for you. They've already got that. You don't really need to provide anything on that. The only thing that we left up to your decision to leave is if you aren't using the American Red Cross forms, and I'm going to emphasize that, you should use the American Red Cross forms for resource ordering generally. If you're not using American Red Cross resource order forms, then you have to insert your process that you're going to use and what forms you use to order from the ARC DOC. So, and I don't know, Mike, do you accept resource order forms other than ARC resource order forms? That wasn't right. So here, if you're going to use other forms, you just would, that's where you insert your own process in your forms. We've given you the ARC hotline. That 800 number is a 24/7, and so that is a number that you can contact. So if we're going to talk about resource order procedures internal to your jurisdiction, now that's resource ordering between your field command, a department operations center, or an EOC, you most likely have your own, you might have your own resource ordering process, and you might have your own forms. So one of the things in here, if you notice, this is where you're going to insert whatever forms you use and whatever process it is. But you want to definitely be fairly clear to the reader a general flow, a cycle of how resources are moving, who they go to, and then what you're using to fill out those resource requests. And most likely you already have those in place. It's highly likely that those agencies or departments within your jurisdiction that are your key public safety have a resource management process in place. For think fire, police. So a lot of times if you're just in that infant stages of really fleshing out this resource management cycle and flow and what you're going to use, bringing them to the table, and that's what we did with ours. And then we actually mapped out the different types of resource management flow. We did diagrams that shows the way resource orders move, where they move, and then how those resources move back. So somebody is very clear how that resource management process is going to work. That's a tricky area, but we feel that we've given you a lot of good language. So you have a choice here. You can either use, see the city EOC resource order procedures. You can either use those numbers 1 through 6 that I've provided for you, which is a general overview, recommended, this is how a resource management process should flow. Or if you do it totally different from the flow that I've given, under that or, you're going to insert your jurisdiction's actual EOC resource ordering process. So you have an option there. You either keep the language we've given, or maybe delete some of the bullets, or you have to write out a whole different section here and describe your resource ordering process. But remember, you don't need to get in the weeds. You keep it very general. Okay. We also provided just a real quick, if you're having to move into mutual aid, that means you're close to exhausting your local resources and you have to move up and make any kind of resource request to the county. The county uses the Operational Area Response and Recovery System, ORS, and that is their software program that they use for resource ordering. They do provide training. It's actually on their website. You can go in and find out the dates. You don't need to describe their process here. You just need to know that they actually have their own program that you would need to go in, and your EOC or DOC would need to fill out a resource order within their software program called ORS. So I'm going to make a strong recommendation that you get and find out those training dates, and you learn how to do that in case you ever have to reach out. Okay. Now, one of the things that that is really kind of important is you're going to have a lot of people that are reading this plan and that are involved in your shelter operations that really don't normally are familiar with resource management. So what we've done here is I have included recommended, if you have a form or you haven't developed a form, these are the sections that you really should have in a really good resource order form, and there's a number of reasons why. Obviously, the top of the form, the date, the incident, because if you ever move to reimbursement, having your documentation that is easily recognizably attached to the incident will be really critical when you turn in your documentation as part of that reimbursement process. So by making sure even your resource order forms are linked to an incident is going to help you in that financial administration function as you close out this incident and move into formal reimbursement. Resource details, the reason you do the resource details is because a lot of times, especially fire and police know what I'm talking about when we talk about typed. There's a lot of resources in emergency management that aren't typed. And so if it's a typed resource, fire and police, all you need to do is give the title of the resource and they know what they're talking about. But in our world in emergency management, a lot of our resources aren't. So you're going to have to give some details, because if you don't give good details, you're in jeopardy of getting the wrong thing. And this happens all the time. You don't want to write the great American novel, but you definitely want to give it, like, here's a good example. If you are ordering a dump truck, okay, that's great. You order a dump truck, and that actually is a typed resource, but here's what happens. If you order a dump truck, you're going to get your dump truck. But if you don't specify that you need a driver with it, you're not going to get the driver. So this is what we talk about. It's a real simple example, but it's really important that you put what you want on there and make sure that somebody else reading it is very clear. That's critical. Delivery details, pretty self-evident. Who is requesting? And who's requesting is the initial person, wherever that point is. It may be somebody at the shelter, it may be somebody at field command, and then you're going to get where in the EOC that resource order either came in at. In the city of Los Angeles, all EOC, all resource orders come into our operations section. So all of our branches in our operations section are actually filling out any resource orders that are coming in. Once they fill out the resource order and the operations section coordinator looks at it and approves it, then it goes over to logistics. So when it comes in, there's that EOC position, that initial position, and then that position that's going to accept it over in logistics is going to go ahead and put their name and everything. So you actually are following the path and you're able to identify who's actually responsible. Close that information. Did you fill it? Are you able to fill it? Is it pending? Source and cost information will be filled out by your finance and admin people or maybe your logistics people. But that's a good comprehensive resource order form. It doesn't need to be really fancy, but that information that's listed there is good. Now here's the advantages. By putting it in this plan, is everybody pretty clear about how you manage resources in your jurisdiction? By that description that I gave there. Yeah, because it shows the flow. So that's the advantage of using that language there and describing it. Resource lists, it's really good to develop resource lists and have those at the critical points. Definitely your emergency operations center. The types of lists that are good to have are your shelter sites, vendor contracts. Those are really critical. Having a lot of the resources that you may end up, as the incident unfolds, you may have to tap into, maybe with vendors. And so knowing what you have as far as vendor contracts to tap into is really critical. So having those vendor lists available at the logistics table or wherever your logistics is a really great idea. You may not have it, so you'll need to delete it. But where do you have these durable medical catches? And durable medical catches, DMEs, are things like crutches and wheelchairs. If you don't have catches, a good list to have would be those specific vendors that provide these very specific accessibility resources for people with disabilities. The reason you separate them out as a vendor is because you may need to grab them very quickly and get a hold of those vendors right away to ensure accessibility on your shelter. So those are the type of lists that we really recommend that you do. We know that shelter registration is a real critical process. That's the first point where your clients are coming in to your facility or site, and you definitely want to capture who's coming in there. The forms, you can use the American Red Cross forms. They've been using them for years, highly recommended. But that intake, that first initial registration, is the first chance that you have to really start to bring in and identify and record those people that are going to be using your facilities. And there's different types of forms that you can use for that initial registration. Again, you notice my little comment. Are you using American Red Cross forms for your registration? Highly recommended. Don't try and reinvent the wheel, but there are some jurisdictions that do like to do their own thing. So if you aren't using the ARC forms, you have to change it in here and reference your forms that you're using for registration. Case management is a real tough one. Case management is like recovery. Case management on people that are coming into your shelter starts when they first step through that door. Now, you as a jurisdiction most likely aren't going to be managing that case management if it extends beyond and it continues after the closing of the shelter. But a lot of that initial information that you collect, the forms that you fill out, actually are the beginning of case management. And so we mark it as a consideration for you to think about, because how effectively you build your document processing in your shelter site. How effective are you compiling those documents? Are you making sure they aren't scattered throughout the shelter? I will tell you another thing with taking registration information is there's a lot of privacy information on that. So knowing who can be assigned for your registration is real critical. Now, obviously, American Red Cross comes in and they manage our shelters. They handle that registration. But if it's a city-managed shelter and American Red Cross is not there, a good division or department to have handle registration is your human resources. Because on a day-to-day basis, human resources or personnel handles confidential information all the time, because they handle our confidential information, right? So they are very versed at it. But you have to have a process that you're protecting those documents, that you're making sure they're organized, they're in a safe, secure place, and those are the very beginnings of case management. But you as a jurisdiction, those will definitely transition, and we reference that at the very bottom. They will transition most likely if it's things like mental health care or some kind of medical care or any kind of public assistance. That's going to transition out beyond your jurisdictional control to another location. So you have to think about case management starting as soon as you open those doors, that those documents that you're filling out are the beginning of case management. Ashu, I'm not putting you on the spot or anything, but John, did you want to add anything to that case management that I didn't cover? Only because there are certain county departments that take over that paperwork, I know. Like,
the only thing I will add is that it's really important. We've had several situations where these incidents last more than just a day, 2 days, and the more information and detail that you get in case management early on, it helps narrow the scope. Because the situation I was thinking about was in a city in Area E where after the event happened 3 or 4 more days, we weren't able to clarify how many people were actually involved and how many people came in and started wanting services and wanting resources, because it was an opportunity to get additional resources. So that's why that's just one example. I think it's really important to have good case management and documentation.
And then there's also, let's say, the people that apply for our public assistance programs, that we may maintain their case. They may need cash assistance, Medi-Cal, emergency food stamps and such. So that's something that we would manage. But often it's also nonprofits. I know Salvation Army sometimes does case management, Catholic Charities. So connecting with those agencies within your community that can do that on a regular basis.
So we're going to move into food services, and the thing about food services is, again, if American Red Cross is our partner and they're with us there, the food services are going to be handled under their direction. But one of the things to think about is when we talk about food services, there's a number of considerations that we have to think about. We may have dietary needs, and we have to accommodate those. So we may have people that can't eat certain foods. There's cultural differences also, and when we look at that diversity of feeding, we are providing basic food and water, But we have to recognize that that may be a little bit more complicated than just that simple statement. So this is where your jurisdiction, you may want to expand this a little bit more and just identify under bullets is what kind of, we know dietary needs, vegetarian, those are, vegan, those are pretty straightforward, lactose intolerant, things like that. You also want to think about baby formula, things like that. We always think of adults, but you got to think of the needs of children, okay? So what kind of foods do you need to provide for children? And then not only that, those cultural, what what ethnic communities do you have out there? There's a lot of places in our county that have, large populations of, different ethnic groups. And so just knowing your community and what you might be faced to having to provide. This is where really reaching out to local vendors can really help you. Because if you have a community that has specific dietary needs, go to the vendors that normally serve those people in those areas and have them contract with them to provide food services, because they're definitely going to be able to accommodate those needs. So those are just some recommended things on the food services. Public safety is actually broken up into a number of different areas. It's pretty self-explanatory. That's really looking at ensuring the safety of those clients that you have coming into the facility. Some of these are pretty straightforward. So safety and security are the responsibility of local public safety agencies, including, and this is that first point where you're going to identify those agencies or departments that are really tasked with the public safety. Obviously, right away you can think it's going to be your police department, but maybe your fire department, but maybe you have some other agencies. Like I mentioned, our Department of Transportation has traffic officers, and we're going to get into that. Crowd control, traffic control, things like that. But looking at those initial public safety agencies, and you're just going to insert those right there. The responsibilities, pretty general, but you manage and control security, coordinate with the shelter manager, and that's really critical. A lot of times we've seen, and this happens because when you think of normal day-to-day, a lot of times departments aren't really used to that coordination flow between them. A lot of times you'll have law enforcement will show up at a shelter and they'll be managing security, but they're never connecting with inside the facility. They're managing their operations outside, and that's great because they know, they're used to doing that traffic control. But it's really critical to recognize that whoever is on scene at a care and shelter site, you're part of that organization. So if you're law enforcement and you're providing security on the outside of the facility, remember I showed you that shelter organization? You're under the operations, and maybe the only thing you're doing is just touching base and communicating back and forth. But you have to recognize that even if you're a public safety agency on the outside, you're still part of that shelter organization. You just need to be talking with the shelter manager, and that also goes for the shelter manager inside, that communications flow. And we're going to talk about communications flow here in a second. So we talk about if the EOC is not activated, the ARC representative at the incident command post, that may be one representative that's embedded at the command post, and if they're there, they're going to take care of everything. But we brought up that situation where ARC is not available, and so it might be that city department that's responsible. Okay, so they're gonna might end up having to make sure that they're overseeing those public safety responsibilities. Okay. If the EOC is activated, again, the EOC is there to support the field. There's going to be that oversight of the shelter facility, but it also on site at the shelter, in the shelter organization, is going to be this public safety function embedded in that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the areas that may come up under safety and security. No weapons. Weapons are not allowed in an American Red Cross shelter. So nobody is allowed to bring in weapons. That's their policy. I don't know what your city policy is, but it would stand to reason that that would be a policy most likely that you had for your jurisdiction also. So what a client has the option of doing is you cannot take a weapon from somebody showing up at a shelter. They want to use the shelter and they have their weapon with them. Now, I'm not going to describe the circumstances where you would definitely confiscate. I think common sense tells us we know when that would be. But if you have somebody, let's say a family, they got in their car, they had 2 minutes to evacuate, You know, they've got their bags, they grab their bags, somebody inadvertently, you know, put their weapon inside of the bag, and they show up at the registration and they've got a weapon. Okay, they can choose to temporarily release custody of that weapon. So in the city of Los Angeles, the weapons policy for the shelter is if a client releases a weapon to law enforcement, and that's why we have law enforcement on hand, is law enforcement should have a temporary process or procedure to secure and hold that weapon till that client leaves the shelter. Okay, we're not going to talk about if that client actually has a criminal record. What you do after that person leaves the shelter is up to law enforcement. But if that client comes in to use the shelter for care and shelter, they do have an option to release their weapon temporarily. So do you need some kind of a weapons policy, a temporary hold, custody? Yes, because that could happen. Because you can turn somebody away from a shelter, but we put it as a consideration, and you need, these people are in need of a place. They've been impacted by a disaster. It's not going to look very good for you to turn somebody away and you didn't have a procedure, because it was a consideration that we knew was going to happen. So my recommendation, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can go to other law enforcement agencies, whoever's law enforcement here, and there's probably a lot of them that have a 2 or 3 page document on their weapons policy for shelters. Rob and duplicate. It's called R&D, and we do that a lot because we're not reinventing the wheel here. Just go ahead and ask some other jurisdictions. I know LAPD has one. So if worse comes to worse, you can reach out to them and get that weapons policy. You don't have to rewrite something from scratch. Okay, and here's some sample language that we give. The temporary surrender of a firearm will be required as a condition for entry. Again, we give you some sample language here, but if you are going to have a different approach and procedure, you'll need to write that into this section. But you will have to have something that states what you're going to do if somebody shows up with a weapon. Criminal activity, pretty straightforward. Unaccompanied minors. Okay, so this area is very, very critical because unaccompanied minors is actually a category that's protected. So we know that an unaccompanied minor, unaccompanied minor could show up at your shelter. And the challenges are going to be is that unaccompanied minor has to be placed in a very secure situation with somebody assigned to that unaccompanied minor that's going to oversee and watch them. And we know that from things after action, lessons learned from Katrina, we know the ramifications of not making sure that we're protecting our children when they're coming into these locations. So this is just a general language, but if you notice, we actually identify a procedure. This is actually so when we talk about an unaccompanied minor coming and showing up at a registration, if American Red Cross is there, there is an unaccompanied minor form that needs to be filled out where you record that unaccompanied minor. You're going to need to look at who is assigned to stay with. Law enforcement can retain temporary custody of an unaccompanied minor. So for a short period of time, law enforcement can take custody of an unaccompanied minor. But when you have an unaccompanied minor that shows up, we actually describe the process. So the shelter manager is going to immediately notify the incident command post and the EOC, because that's critical to know that an unaccompanied minor has showed up in a shelter, because you want that on record. And then the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, and they actually have a 24/7 number. You're going to want to call them right away because they're our resource to come to the shelter and go ahead and take custody of that unaccompanied minor until an official guardian, parent, etc. shows up. So I can't emphasize enough that this is an area that you're really going to make sure that everybody's trained on, that you've identified that who's going to take temporary custody, ensure that those people are bonded, background checks, all the requirements that go with the issues that we know when we're talking about unaccompanied minors. Okay. This is one of those areas that if it's not handled correctly in a shelter, the political fallout and ramifications can be huge. So it's in our we were with you. It's in your best interest to really kind of weed this one out and really be clear and everybody on the same page. Traffic management is pretty straightforward. Whoever you use for traffic management, remember security, the things like weapons, custody, unaccompanied minor, crime, that's definitely going to need to be your law enforcement. But when we start to talk about traffic management, we all know that all of us are disaster service workers, right? In the state of California, I don't know if you have that program in your jurisdiction, but during times of emergency, all public civil service employees are disaster service workers. And we could get temporarily assigned to another responsibility if it's safe for us to do so and we've gotten minimal training. So we all know that there are resources already in our jurisdictions that you can assign to traffic control around the perimeter. Could be law enforcement, but in the case like for us, a lot of times we at Rec and Parks officers will sometimes do traffic control around a facility. Our DOT officers will come and help out. So you may have other departments that aren't within law enforcement or divisions that could help out with this. When we talk about transportation management or that traffic management, you should actually establish a shelter management traffic plan. Just kind of shows the flow of traffic, and in that plan, you definitely want to identify the control of the outer perimeter, the arrival and drop-off points for your public, ingress and egress areas, and that includes ingress and egress for emergency response vehicles like ambulances, because you could have a medical emergency at the shelter, supplies, deliveries, and personnel, donation, redirection to donation sites. So I'm going to ask you guys here, we could take a 5-minute break. We're a little ahead of schedule. Or I could just plow through the remainder of these considerations and then we go to lunch when I finish. Thanks, you guys. Yeah, and the rest of this is going to go fairly quickly because I think most of the big ones we've taken. So transportation, won't go into that in depth. It's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing is any section that I'm reviewing, you have to read through it and make sure it applies. But you definitely want to, under this, service animals and emotional support animals, the very last sentence in that section. Service animals go with their owners into shelters. So when we talk about the support of any needs in a shelter, well, you may have some animal service needs in your shelter for service animals. Okay, and this is going to be besides if you activate an animal shelter. So right there for that one, for service animals, so one of the things that you're going to have to look at is in your shelter, do you have a department that may be responsible for that animal support? So if you don't, then whoever is your department lead for the overall care and shelter has the responsibility of providing real basic animal care needs, and we're going to cover those in a checklist at the back. So communications is a very extensive area. We know that's usually in after action reports. That's always one of those areas that's really challenging. The only thing to remember about communications, and we'll actually provide you a communications checklist at the end of this template, communications are 2 areas. They're not just one. Communications talks about the systems that you have in place. Do you have radios? Do you have software program? Do you have telephones? Do you have a runner system? That's the movement of the information. But there's actually communication also involves that process where you're sharing information. Do you have a process where you can actually share periodic situation reports between the shelter and your EOC or the shelter and field command? So when we talk about communications, it isn't just the systems and the hardware. We're also talking about that information sharing process. And you'll notice in this section that we've kind of defined that out. And we actually go into this whole process a little bit more in depth in a communication checklist in the back. But just remember that you have to have that dual process in place. It's not just identifying what equipment you're going to have on scene. It's how's the information going to flow? How's it going to flow internally in the shelter, and then how is it going to flow between the shelter and those other points that need to know? And so if you notice here, this following applies to communication to care and shelter clients. So you can just read through those and see what apply. But some of these things, like for example, one of the bullets says, use pictograms for questions and providing key information. Your jurisdiction may not have that. A lot of these bullets that I have in here for communication are recommended. Pictograms are great. They're a laminated card that has visual diagrams. You can actually use it for people, with language translation challenges, and it actually is a good way to communicate with people by just looking at the pictures. If you need the names of those vendors, Michael's got vendors back there that you can access to get those, but I hardly recommend that you go out and they're not that expensive, that you make purchases for your shelter kits of those pictograms, because they're very effective and they comply with accessibility requirements. And we all know that people with languages are part of those access and functional needs. And so if you have those pictograms, you've actually met compliance on some of the accessibility requirements, or it helps you to meet compliance. There's a number of different areas. Sign language interpreters, for example, is another area for accessibility. So just review those considerations and make sure each of those bullets your city can provide. Health and medical support. We know that health and medical, your fire department may have some responsibility, will have responsibility for some basic medical response. A lot of times your fire department won't have personnel on scene, so your emergency response for medical will be through your regular 911 process. For example, a lot of times depending on the incident, is our fire, LAFD is, their resources are dedicated to the management of the incident in the field. They may not be able to embed medical personnel, EMS or paramedics at the shelter site, but there's already a 911 system that's in place in your jurisdiction that has response times built in. So it just becomes a matter of the shelter will call the 911. But when we talk about public health and mental health, even in the city of Los Angeles, we depend on the county departments to provide those services for us. And we're going to talk about how you build your stakeholder involvement in this plan. LA County Public Health and LA County Mental Health, John's department, DPSS and DCFS are all part of a mutual care and shelter support network. So when we talk about this post-workshop work, we're going to talk about how you bring them in as your stakeholders, because they are definitely part of your plan, and they provide services in there. So there's that emergency medical transport will be handled by 911. Fatality management, tragically, it could happen in a shelter, and so you need to look at the department. Usually it's law enforcement or fire, but you could have a fatality on hand at a shelter, and we are not allowed to move fatalities before the coroner comes on scene, so you're going to have a management process to deal with that at the shelter. Obviously, you're going to remove it from the public, but you have to have a respect and care process in place that you show a dignified respect to the deceased until the coroner can arrive on hand and respect the privacy. So there is a little bit of a fatality management component. Talked about that site reporting, which is part of that communication. I'm not going to go into it in depth, but there's a lot of information at the shelter that needs to be shared back and forth between the field and the EOC. Okay, or a DOC. That's going to depend on you. You might have a situation report form that captures all this information. You can just reference that form, whatever you use, if that form's going to be used. The shelter, there is actually a shelter log form that actually captures a lot of information. That could be a very good, useful situation report form for you. But if you're also going to require your standard EOC situation report form to be filled out at the shelter, or you're going to at least want them to share that information, you're going to want to identify those essential elements of information. That's what we call them, that's the term. But those really critical pieces of information that you need to get and you need to share back and forth. But I've given you a list here of some recommended here on the bullet, so you just need to review that. Not a lot to fix in there. Volunteer and donations management. I'm not going to take a lot of time on this. We did not give you any language on volunteer management because that's totally up to how your jurisdiction handles volunteers. There are some options for you. There are organizations that manage volunteers. Emergency Network of Los Angeles is one. Volunteers Organizations of America, I always forget them, the VOAD. Manage volunteers all the time. Is bring them to the table when you develop this plan and see if they'll manage your volunteer management component for you, and then what you will do is you will describe what that process will be. Volunteer management is huge. You are going to get people that show up as spontaneous volunteers at the shelter. So going back to how we've been framing this plan, so under this section you could put for ARC managed shelters, volunteer management will be incorporated under the American Red Cross process. And then the only thing you would have to describe is if you're going to take volunteers into a city managed shelter, you'll just have to describe who'd be responsible for that volunteer management and how you do that. When we talk about donations, that's really challenging. American Red Cross does not accept any cash donations at a shelter site, so in your public information campaign, you're definitely going to want to just provide that American Red Cross information. So get with your PIOs, make sure that they're very clear on that. In-kind donations, there's information on there. You may have merchants that come in and approach you about volunteering food. All public shelters are under public health guidelines, so you have to be a little bit careful on that. And public health, LA County Public Health may show up at your shelter and do an inspection. That can happen. So when you look at merchants showing up for in-kind donations, it could happen, but you're going to have to look at how are you going to manage that and restrict that. Food donations, again, food that's prepared at a care and shelter site is under strict public health guidelines. So the food, that food, anybody coming in and volunteering, like a lot of times you'll have residents that'll bake the cakes and the cookies and all that and bring them up. You really can't take those. So that'll have to be something that you'll have to address. And a great way to mitigate that is in your public information campaign. It's just to communicate to the public, this is what we will accept, okay? Clothing. Clothing always shows up. A great organization that can handle that for you and they need to be at your table is the Salvation Army. And actually, if you're going to have any kind of a place where people are going to be able to drop off their clothing, you kind of want to try to co-locate that by the Red Cross or by the shelter. But Salvation Army will come out and they'll actually manage that clothing intake, and they'll go ahead and take the clothes, and so you want to work with them. There might be other nonprofit organizations in your community that is more than willing to take those clothing and take them to their thrift shops. So you really want to tap into that, because the last thing you want to manage as a city is clothing donations, because those can be overwhelming. And those can be very staff intensive, but you may be faced with taking those, okay? Transition to recovery, we don't go into recovery a lot. The one thing to remember about this plan is it only addresses short-term sheltering. We do know that there may be people that are going to have to transition to a long-term housing solution. You don't write this into this plan because this is not about long-term housing. This is the temporary provision of basic food, place to stay, water, some basic human services needs for a temporary amount of time. So what we do reference, though, is that transition to recovery. And where you really do need to address that recovery piece is if you have a recovery annex, or if your EOP moves into recovery, then you want to address people coming out of shelters with long-term care housing needs. This is how they will flow into recovery. But this plan, and it qualifies that, does not describe that long-term housing, okay? Feeding operations at a care and shelter site, okay? And so you won't shut down any feeding. You might have a shelter that shuts down, but you have to maintain feeding operations. You're really going to shut down those operations once there's no more need for that. And then any supplies at the site, obviously, you're going to make sure they get back to the right places and have a process and procedures in your checklist that says, okay, this needs to be returned. Please inspect this, make sure it's okay. Documentation and timekeeping, we're going to go into that a little bit later on, but the most important thing is this is like everything. You may not think it's really important at the time that you're in the heat of the battle at the shelter site, but that documentation that you're producing is a record. And you don't know where that incident is going to go and what is eventually going to move into a reimbursement process or even an auditing process. So you want to have a finance and admin process embedded, and you're going to have certain departments in your jurisdiction that are going to definitely want that documentation. So start bringing them in at the forefront, maybe actually making them your finance and admin section up in that shelter organization. But you're going to want to have a process where you're not only making sure that you're doing the documentation, that you're making sure it's filled out correctly, you're compiling it, you're organizing it, and you're making it very easily for somebody to come along and see that storyline or that timeline of events.